for Heidegger, reality was what you experienced. So he sort of tipped the tables. Instead of presuming an objective world and then deriving the subjective from it, he presumed that the entirety of your experiences were real. And that included your emotions and your felt motivational states, and your dreams and your fantasies, and even your delusions. Now that doesn't mean that people like Heidegger thought that all the elements of lived reality belonged in the same category. So if you thought that dreams and the reality that you share with other people were indistinguishable from one another, you'd be just as pathological to a phenomenologist as to anyone else. But they were trying to get back to the central mystery of life, which is that there is something rather than nothing, I suppose, and that we experience it. And that's the place where Rogers starts. One of the presumptions of the Rogerians is that in order to help someone, you have to put yourself in their shoes, fundamentally. So you have to try to see the world from their perspective. And that means adopting the viewpoint. It means adopting the reality that manifests itself to them, so that you can develop an empathic understanding and a body-focused understanding of the person that you're talking to. Rogers believed that it was the moral responsibility of the therapist to do that personally, and then that to the degree that that was being done in the therapy relationship, in the therapeutic relationship, that in and of itself would be healing. And so basically, Rogers' theory is that honest communication heals. Now, you know, that's quite an interesting theory. You know, it's not completely unallied from Freud's earlier claims, right? Because Freud basically presumed that it was Freud didn't put so much of a moral element on it. I mean, he really viewed the person more as being trapped between titanic opposing forces, you know, the id underneath and the superego on top, and poor little ego sort of crunched up in the middle. And as a consequence of being pulled and prodded and crushed by those titanic forces, pathology was likely to emerge. And he talked about repression, but Freud tended to view repression as an unconscious process. For Rogers, the moral element of the therapeutic process is much clearer, I believe. And most of the time when you listen to Rogers or you read what he had to say, the injunctions that he's laying out are moral injunctions. Now, it's quite interesting, because you don't necessarily think of psychotherapy as a moral endeavor. And I really never thought about it that way fully until I read Jung. I was reading Rogers at the same time. But Jung laid out the proposition in his book that most of the problems, many of the problems that people came to see a therapist about were actually moral problems. And they were moral problems of various sorts. Now, sometimes the person was in trouble because they had done something seriously wrong. He had one client, if I remember correctly, and he discovered, if I remember correctly, that she had killed her children. And she did that when they were young. She let them become exposed to tuberculosis, I think it was. She didn't take the proper precautions. And the reason she did that was because she wanted to marry someone, and he wasn't very interested in her children. So you might consider that a moral problem. Apparently it was weighing on her conscience, as it might well. Now, it's a strange thing, because in some sense what she did was turn a blind eye to something she could have prevented. In legal terms, that's known as willful blindness. But she knew whatever that means. Well, there's lots of different levels of knowing, right? You can know something in your body, you can know something in your imagination, you can know something in articulated form, you know, so the whole issue of knowing is very complicated. But Rogers definitely believed, as far as I can tell, that there was a moral dimension to life, that it was identifiable, that in some sense it was linear, that it had an observable process, which was the continual integration of experience within the phenomenal field, the ironing out of contradictions within the phenomenal field. So you might think, well, what happens when you feel one way and you say something else? I mean, you're all perfectly familiar with that experience. In fact, my experience with people has been that, and this is another issue of instrumental use of language. You know, you say, well, what are you using your language for? Well, to get what you want. Well, that can be consciously manipulative, and maybe we'll say, well, that's what the psychopath is like, except the psychopath is not only consciously manipulative, he's also unconsciously manipulative, because he's been practicing it for like 3 decades. So all the little machines in his head are deceptive too, and they run on automatic. So he'll just lie just to see if he can pull one over on you, because that demonstrates that not only is he smarter than you, but that you deserve to be victimized because you're such an idiot. So, but people use instrumental language like that not only consciously to get what they want, but you know, it's something that we definitely think of as characteristic, for example, of teenagers. Right? I mean, there isn't a teen movie that's been made in the last 50 years, I don't think, that doesn't deal with the negative consequences of using instrumental language, right? Basically, the teen is put in some position where they're being pulled by maybe various social forces, different friendship groups, or there's a contradictory relationship between what their friends want and their parents want, or what their friends want and their school wants, or what they want and their friends want, or what the school wants. So all of these things are pulling and pushing in different directions, and the directions are essentially, in some sense, the directions are moral, because they're all about what to do. And the plot of the movie is how the teenager, it's usually a Rogerian plot, it's usually about how the teenager comes to fuller self-realization, right? And that they're able to stave off the temptations that are posed sometimes by the authorities, so they don't become too obedient, and sometimes by their peers, so that they don't become only a reflection of peer pressure. Question?
I was just going to say, would peer pressure be a good example of something that could cause the use of instruments?
Absolutely. Peer pressure is absolutely that. And so, if you're using language to fit in, well, that's also instrumental use of language, and for Rogers, that would be one of the sources of pathology. Now, it's very much worth taking this seriously. So, here's an example that I've thought about a lot. What do you do if you're at work and someone tells you to do something that you don't want to do? And I don't mean that, assume you're disciplined, you know. Assume that you're not just lazy and worthless, and that's why you don't want to do it. And you want to ask yourself that first, right? Because maybe you're just being lazy and worthless, and you should pull yourself together and do the thing, you know. So, but failing that, let's say that you're being asked to do something that you're having a very difficult time to get motivated to do. So that'd be one clue. And that it's also making you uneasy. So you're waking up in the middle of the night and you're being anxious and it's running through your mind, and what should you do? Well, it's your job. Someone who's in the hierarchy above you is telling you to do it. Maybe you should just do it. Well, then you might ask yourself, well, why can't you just go ahead and do it? You know, you might say, well, maybe it's quasi-criminal and you're afraid of getting caught, but let's forget about that for a minute. Let's assume that the probability, maybe it's a low-level moral transgression, it's not precisely illegal, and even so, the probability that you're going to get caught is very low. Why would it bother you? And should you take that seriously? Now, Rogers would claim that the reason it would bother you is because it would make the structure of your self-system inconsistent.